So as I'm getting this ready, let me just echo Robin in that, not that we've known each other for that long, but that I don't consider myself a gender and diversity scholar. I identify as organizational psychologist, although I should point out that Faye Crosby, who's sitting in this front row, was one of my favorite professors that many years ago, and she reminded me today that my first publication ever was a chapter with her about gender. And so we decided that we could say that I've been a gender expert for 30 years. Okay, I want to start by telling a story. Let me put my watch on. So other than writing, I also do some work with organizations. And I got called in by an organization. It was a hospital, and it was the OR in the hospital. And they called me in because they wanted some help, because there was lots of conflicts between the surgeons and the nurses. Lots of conflicts. Most of the surgeons, this will stun you, were male. Most of the nurses were female. And they called me and they essentially said, they're going at it like cats and dogs. These are all quotes. And the presenting problem in this unit was this pre-op procedure, where before a surgeon was allowed to start, there was this checklist that needed to be filled out, and the nurses were given the authority to essentially go through the checklist and make sure it was complete before the surgeons were allowed to actually start the operation. You can imagine what that did in this organization. It upended the normal, quote unquote, normal power relationships between surgeons and nurses. And lo and behold, they weren't doing it very well or getting along very well. So they called me in. And I spent time talking to them, understanding sort of what was going on here. And what I discovered over time was that the story they gave me was radically incomplete. The story they gave me was essentially about the men and women, surgeons and nurses, couldn't communicate well or get along or figure out how to come to common ground. And it turns out that as I spent time talking with them, I discovered that there was another story underneath. And the other story underneath was 5 years earlier, there had been a signal event, a sentinel event. There had been something called a wrong site surgery. And I hope most of you have no idea what that is. But a wrong site surgery essentially is the surgeon operated on the wrong body part. And it happens, right? Medical errors happen. And what then happened is, as soon as it happened, the administrators came in and essentially said to everybody who was in both the room and in the unit themselves, you are not allowed to talk about this. They essentially put a gag order on everybody in the unit, and that was about liability. The patient survived. There was lots of liability issues, but they were not allowed to talk about it. And so they didn't ever talk about it. And so instead, what happened was this sequence of events where, in not talking about it, the emotions that were triggered or released by what had happened in that room, and you can imagine the emotions there was shame and humiliation and rage and anger and frustration and sadness. There was all these emotional experiences that were not talked about. And what psychologists know is that emotions not expressed always long for, they seek places to be expressed. And so what it made me really start to think about was how the narratives that you're given are sometimes stand-ins for other narratives that have been hidden and buried, even though the emotions have not. And so I came up with this notion of a sleight of mind. And what I mean by that is, you know, a sleight of hand. You go, there's a magician on the street, or there's an illusionist, right? And they're doing something to distract you from the real story. And what I discovered is that in this organization, and in others as well, the real story gets hidden by some distracting story. But the cool part is, in the distracting story, the emotions that were triggered in the first event get played out in this other story. Which means, of course, that you can't really figure out how to solve this distracting story, because that's not the real story. And so this notion of what I sort of started thinking about is the conversations that people have are choices to also not have other conversations in organizations. I should point out now, this is all unconscious. People aren't doing this, quote unquote, on purpose. This happens in some unconscious fashion. I'll try not to say that too much. And so what happens is we create these distractions and then unconsciously embed the distractions in the stories we tell. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes are about conversations that are real and conversations that are not real. And what I want to do is talk about how what the relationship is between the conversations that are real and the ones that are not real. So how do you know if you're in what I call a counterfeit conversation? How do you know if you're operating on the wrong story? And I didn't mean operating in that way. So one is people are having the same conversations over and over and over, which means they're the wrong conversations, right? In other words, if they're having the same conversation and there's no movement, there's no progress, as David said before, it means that it's probably the wrong conversation. The second one is this notion of emotion. If there's too much emotion, that is, if an event should be annoying but it's enraging, or it should be that it's somewhat disappointing but people go into despair or sadness. For me, the image is it's almost like there's a quart. Well, you have a quart and you have a gallon of emotion, which means there's leakages and spillages and spillovers everywhere, right? So it means there's probably some emotions that have been bootlegged or imported from one conversation or one issue into another. And the third indicator is the stories people tell are incredibly simplistic. And the most simplistic, obvious story is the world is divided into protagonists and antagonists. We, of course, always the protagonists, and they, whoever they are always the antagonists, right? We are on the heroic journey, and those people, those others, are somehow obstacles to the journeys we're on. So those are the three indicators that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that help us understand when we're somehow in the wrong conversation. So, and the words I use are counterfeit and genuine. And I like the word counterfeit because the counterfeit, I mean, think about a master forger, right? There's enough of the genuine and the real that it passes for real, but it's not. So a counterfeit conversation is one when people are hiding their genuine or vulnerable selves. So in the OR, the genuine experiences people had were fraught with all this emotion, and also the anxiety of talking about what had happened, right? As healers, it made them very anxious to talk about errors or mistakes, and there was no safe place for them to talk about it. And so because they couldn't talk about it, they essentially defended as opposed to revealed their actual experiences in that moment. And in defending, they also remained unaware of doing so. And yet everything felt real to them, right? Their emotions felt real. They have felt like they were having the right conversations, right? This pre-op thing is crazy, but nurses say, but we have to do it this way. And there was this nurse manager, and she became the lightning rod. Everyone was focused on her as the good guy or the bad guy, right? People felt like they were having the right fights. But there was just too much emotion, and by the time I had gotten there, they'd been having these fights for 2 years without any progress. And actually, the other thing I should say is, the chief who brought me in, he brought me in hoping that what I would say to him is, get rid of the nurse manager and everything will be okay, right? So this very simplistic story and narrative had taken hold in the organization. So what's a genuine conversation? A genuine conversation is when people find the ability, the vulnerability, the courage to instead of defend, they reveal their actual experiences, what happens to them, their anxiety, their despair, their anger at one another. They're able to do that in some way and acknowledge as opposed to suppress or hide the emotional realities and reveal themselves. So I spent probably 6 months working with them after I finally sort of got it, sort of what had happened, and helped them think about what had happened. And after 6 months, here was the conversation we were able to have. And it was guided by these questions. How do we deal with painful events that affect us all? What do we do with our feelings of anger, guilt, shame, sadness? Who are we together amidst distress? Who do we want to be in terms of intimacy, connection, and compassion? Are we creating settings where we feel cared for, supported by one another during difficult times? And based on those conversations, what are the implications for who we want to be together? Right? And if you'll notice this genuine conversation, and it was a moving conversation. The surgeon who had committed the error, he broke down in a way that people needed to see, right? They needed to stop demonizing him in that process. The nurses started to take some of their own the anger they projected onto him, and realized there are things that they missed as well during the process as it went along, right? They started to have moments of forgiveness of themselves and one another that in some ways started to move them, right? It started to unify them. They started to see how they had been caught or trapped in this world together. So they were moved emotionally. They moved them toward one another. I use the words us and we because I think it could be any of us in this situation, right? So they move us toward one another, and they move people and groups and organizations ahead. It turned out once we started to have these conversations, all the anger, all the stuff around the pre-op procedure started to melt away. And they started to find a way for them to collaborate in a way they had never done before. There's more to say, but I'm not going to do that now. A genuine conversation essentially depends and allows us to see ourselves in the other. Remember, in the counterfeit conversation, the struggle was really about this antagonist-protagonist. And as long as you could divide the world that neatly and that simply, then you can always have a place to express these feelings, right? The anger, the resentment, right? You could always have a place to keep doing that. A genuine conversation depends on the fact that we start to frame the world in a different way, right? So the notion of the word frame, right? So when you go in an art gallery, there's a picture, there's a frame on it, and what that frame does is it tells our eye where to look and where not to look. It separates signal from noise. As human beings, in every situation that involves some ambiguity, we need frames. And so the way we create frames is we create stories. We start to tell ourselves stories to quote unquote make sense of a situation. And the sense we make of a situation then determines how we act within it. In a genuine conversation, you start to frame the situation as this thing happened to us together. The people in the OR finally understood this thing had happened to them together, which then meant a flood of the original emotions that had showed up in the first situation showed up again in the room, but now could be contained. It could be contained in a conversation, and the emotions could be linked to the original organization. Okay, so question is, why did it take so long? It took them years, like 5 years, then they finally got me, and it took them a while. And it wasn't that I was magical, it's just that simply I think about the conversations that people have as a way of hiding from others. The question is, what does it do for people to essentially have dysfunction? I believe that if dysfunction exists in an organization, it's because it's serving some unconscious functions. Otherwise, it would be extinguished in some fashion. People would stop and say, this is crazy, why are we doing this? And they'd have a conversation based on if these are our goals and these are objectives, we would do this, duh, right? If they're not doing it, I won't say the words competing commitments, but if they're not doing it, that was for you, right? It means that they're serving some other function for them in some other way. So, what do counterfeit conversations do for us? They allow us to express these bootlegged emotions from some other place that we didn't feel we could actually express them, right? So let me say that in a different way. A situation happens, we feel either because of ourselves or people are giving us the message, we're not allowed to have this conversation. So they don't. So they have to create a different situation in order to express those emotions. It focuses attention outwards rather than inwards to have these counterfeit conversations, and it enables us to avoid consciously experiencing anxiety and distress. So that's why they exist. And unless they're interrupted, they get embedded into the organizational discourse, right? So when I got there, the discourse was all about the nurses and the physicians, the men and the women, were not able to work together. And those narratives continue to fuel these dysfunctional group dynamics and dynamics between groups. The nurse manager got fired. I should mention that. And just as an aside, right? And the reason she got fired is because the narrative had been there so long that even after we were able to help understand how everybody had participated and included in this, she was too far gone. Meaning she had been caught and trapped in this narrative and started to play the role that she was asked to play, which is this incredibly divisive figure. Okay, so now you're sitting here thinking, okay, I think I'm at a gender conference. gender diversity. What the hell does this have to do, right? So these are my attempts, and as David said before, my job here is not to be too stupid. Okay, so thinking about this, I thought to myself, I think there are times, and some of you may not like this, I think there are times where the gender conversation people are having are actually counterfeits. So what do I mean by that? When I got to the organization, the narrative was about the men and the women. Now it's nested between surgeons and nurses as well. There's status and power stuff there too. So it's not simply men and women, it was nested into both, right? But when I got there, that was the narrative. And if I had gone in there as a gender, quote unquote, person and said, come on guys, I think we really need some really thoughtful workshops with the men and with the women separately and then together, would it have done something? Sure. Would it have essentially solved sort of why these emotions kept sort of driving it? I don't think so. So that's what I meant by this notion of gender can be the counterfeit conversation. So how do you know? How do you think about that? Simplistic, divisive narratives that ignore complexities. Okay. So for example, if I believe that organizations and diversity and gender would be so much better if women just created better work-family balance. If that's how I framed it, I think I would, what does that say, Bethany? Thank you. So if I framed it that way, the question is, what does that ignore? What it ignores is the fact that men are involved as well, or organizations are involved as well, or systems are involved as well. This puts it on the women to be better jugglers. Or the second one, if men were just better about the touchy-feely stuff, people would do so much more, people would be so much more effective dealing with diversity in organizations. What's the problem with that narrative? If that's the only narrative I have, it really ignores the fact that in every organization, like in every relationship or every family, everybody has to have a balance of understanding rational and irrational stuff, and people have to be able to speak to emotions as well as the business of the work that gets done, right? So the funny part about it is both of those have just enough truth to pass as genuine. They're not completely wrong, although you may tell me they are. They're not completely wrong, yet they're always partial and splitting and divisive, right? So what would an authentic gender conversation be? I think that it's based on the premise that women and men are in this together. I know it sounds so trite, right? That men and women are interlocking parts of systems, of social and work arrangements. And if you only look at one part of the system, if you're only looking at men, or only looking at women, or only looking at leaders, or only looking at followers, then it's very unlikely that people are going to find genuine conversations that look to see how they're unified. I'm not saying all men and women are the same. All I'm saying is that they're just like in the OR, they were in this world that they shared, even though they had different experiences of it, right? The nurses and doctors have different experiences, but they're in the world together, which to me means they have to first look for how they're bridged or connected. So for example, men and women in all of us organizations are joining common struggles. Struggles around access, opportunity, and rewards across identity groups, humane work arrangements that honor both work and the nurturing of families, defining success and contributions in diverse ways that take gender differences into account. All of those, everyone in this room, everyone in every organization, that's their common struggle. That's not to say that people don't experience them differently or have different levels of interest or issues or biases, but it means if we can start with the unifying conversation, we can then figure out how to actually create the rational work arrangements. So, last slide. How do we get there? One is this notion of vulnerability, right? So working with this OR, when they were vulnerable about what this experience had done to them as human beings, they were literally disarming. When people speak like in a disarming way, they're actually disarming. That is, they drop their arms, and others, instead of casting them as the antagonists, start to see themselves in others. But it starts always with vulnerability. As those of you who are in some sort of partnership or relationship, the disarming power of the apology the heartfelt apology is an astonishing thing. Following the trail, right? What I've said is, you're in a counterfeit conversation and issue when there's too much emotion or the conversations keep looping around. So to step back and say, hang on a second, I have too much emotion. Hang on a second, we're in the same conversation over and over again, which means there's probably a different conversation. All right, seeing systems. The notion of if men and women, people from different identity groups can create a frame that says we're all struggling with X, Y, or Z, whatever the X, Y, and Z is, right? We all want a humane work arrangement that figures out how we collectively nurture families, have our own independent, healthy lives, and get work done in a way, right? We're all in that together in some, oh my God, I sound like a motivational speaker. We're all, right, we all struggle with the same issue, even though we come at it in very different places, historically and in the present. I have not yet said the word leadership, but leaders are huge in here. The notion of leaders have the authority to frame the conversations, right? I love the word authority because of the word author is in the word authority. Right? Which means leaders have the ability to author, that is to create narratives and stories that help frame people as struggling with the same issues. And finally, always, it's not just about leaders presenting us with the opportunity to have the conversation, it's about the courage of us to be able to step in and move toward that anxiety and actually have that conversation. So that's the way I think about this stuff around organizational dynamics. I need some help around just applying it to gender life. Thank you.